One time. Thank you, Ty. One time I stood up here the whole time, like this. And then Mike Brewers was like, "Is that your power pose?" And I was like, "No, my back hurts." Okay. Good morning. Just finding the top of my sermon. Okay. We've been talking for a few weeks about this concept of gelassenheit, the spiritual practice of serenity / letting go / yielding to God. Katerina talked about a profound experience of serenity when she was swimming in the ocean and releasing part of her future to God, recognizing that God's love might sustain her no matter what was to come, much like the ocean water sustaining her body in that moment. And Lisa Thornton talked about her understanding of gelassenheit through profound grief and disappointment. This time period that's way longer and bumpier than anybody tells you, where you're trying to adjust to something or someone that you've lost. These powerful sermons got me thinking about how gelassenheit often starts with a confrontation, as in there's an initial bumping up against something that we recognize as out of our control. When I told Ali that I had been invited to reflect on gelassenheit, he very rudely questioned whether I was the right messenger for this topic. Despite the fact that my personality and communication style may not exude gelassenheit at all times, I would like to point out that I'm really not unique in this. I happen to know that many people do not enjoy not being in control. I've also been thinking about how much human society has developed in a way that reflects and supports our desires for control. And because our brains haven't evolved as quickly as our technologies, like all the tools we have for predicting, measuring, planning, shopping, researching, and general expanding, I wonder if we haven't caused a bit of psychological agitation for ourselves, or a hubbub, or a kerfuffle, a foo-for-all, if you will. After consulting my thesaurus, I couldn't pick just one. We have so much more information now, and we're addicted to it. We have more choices to make. We have more data to consider when making those choices. Mary was told she was having a baby. She doesn't understand it. She rejoices. Women in the U.S. Don't just have babies. Pregnancy is full of things to monitor, decisions to make, and options for how you get ready. It's not that modern-day pregnancy is fail-safe. It isn't. But there is a lot of data. I've told clients who are pregnant to rest assured that there will be something wrong with their baby. Hopefully nothing serious, but they're monitoring so many things, and legally they have to tell you about every potential condition and risk. There will be something. Same thing with having a wedding or going on vacation. Something always goes wrong, but it's not because of how unlucky you are. It's because of how complicated these things have become and how many things you are in some way measuring and evaluating. There are many, many benefits of data. We can prevent many bad outcomes with understanding how things work. But information does create a burden of decisions and responsibility that people seem to be feeling more and more. In Mary's song, I notice her joy, her sense of God's triumph. But concurrently, I notice her lack of anxiety and perhaps more potently, her lack of personal responsibility. She has an awareness that her story will be known and told for generations all over the world, and she expresses not an ounce of, wait, what if I do something wrong? Is Mary free to celebrate the gelassenheit of her mysterious and miraculous pregnancy, in part because she has no idea what gestational diabetes is? Will she experience a guilt-free motherhood because there were not alternative paths she could have taken and no podcasts about parenting techniques? On the one hand, Mary seems so powerless and vulnerable because she's young and unwed and poor and traveling and doesn't have a place lined up to have this baby. On the other hand, she seems unwaveringly confident that God is in control. I'm not, upset that we live in a time of information overload, and I would never romanticize life before modern medicine or women not being able to earn their own living. I've just been contemplating how our embrace of a gelassenheit must be a little different because of these changes. I think it is not unreasonable to suggest that it might be easier to release control when we actually have less control, or at least fewer delusions of control. There's the willingness to let things be, to accept things as they are, which sounds stoic and spiritual. But we live in a society where it's possible to measure the relative mass of an atom. Or, I don't know, you can order male raccoon urine online and have it delivered to you. So weird. We live in a culture where we admire people for fighting battles they cannot win. Just look at Cher's face. She's turned back time. And yet, Cher is marching inevitably towards death. Good transition. I know that you were expecting a sermon that was really a book review with some jabs at Allie sprinkled on top, but the topic is gelassenheit, and I couldn't find any books on it. I don't think that aging and death can be overlooked when we consider the areas where ultimately we get the least amount of say, where ultimately yielding to the divine love seems to be our best option. But I must also yield to the present circumstances where sermon etiquette dictates that I should speak for another 9 to 11 minutes. And in light of this, I'm going to bypass an examination of aging and death. Instead, I want to help us think through 2 other popular forms of denying our limitations and see where our tradition might help us, especially in the midst of Advent. To point out the obvious, we have gotten a lot better at predicting the weather and perfecting the taste of coffee and curing cataracts, so we really don't need gelassenheit there. Unless you're PMC's most recent newlyweds and it rains in November in California just during the 20-minute ceremony. This brings me to a critical sidebar. Upon writing this sermon, I realized that Alanis Morissette's 1996 hit song, Ironic, could have been an even more smashing hit if it had been called Gelassenheit. So I want you to hear it with me. It's like 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife. It's meeting the man of my dreams and then meeting his beautiful wife. And isn't it Gelassenheit, don't you think? Little too Gelassenheit? Yeah, I really do. Returning from sidebar, Advent, the apparent simplicity of Mary's song, even if, as Lisa was right to point out, it may not have been automatic. That response of a yes to God's will may indeed have started with confusion and fear and a dozen other feelings, not always consistent with each other. But the simplicity of the song, I think, linked to the clarity of this thing is happening now, and the only thing I can control is my response. It reminds me of my first marathon. This isn't important, but I've run 2 marathons, and Allie's just run 1, so I have to clarify. This episode is from my first marathon, not my second. It's different. So before the race, there's lots of standing around and waiting at like 4 in the morning. And I was talking to this girl, telling her, my longest training run was 20 miles or whatever it was, 21. And you get nervous about that last 5.2. I don't know if I can make it. And she had run other marathons before. And she said, on my first marathon, someone pointed at the road ahead of us and said, that's the only way out of this thing. And it kind of clicked for me too. Like, yeah, that's the only option right now. So there's no point worrying about it. Choices are great, but a single straight road ahead of you can also be kind of great at times. And the trick is that in our current times, if we want that clarity, sometimes we have to declutter, we have to remove options. One menu of options that I see sucking a lot of people in, because it seems like a good thing at first, is the menu of self-improvement. I'm talking about ways to optimize your schedule so you can get more done, and optimize your thinking so you can be more focused, and measure your sleep so you can make sure it's optimized. And this whole industry we have around self-improvement, there are parts of it that can be helpful and energizing, but the whole framework of optimization is so locked into pressure. especially during Advent. There can be pressure to enjoy everything, pressure to do all the things, pressure to make people happy, pressure to spend money, and pressure to have stuff. I try to remember and to remind anyone who listens to me, which is not that many people, that the most limited resource other than your time is your attention. And at Christmas, we celebrate not just the birth of Jesus, I think we celebrate the simplicity of it. It is hard to find simplicity in our era, but I'm glad to be in a faith community that values simple living. The other area where we get sucked in, and I'm right there with everyone else, is how attached we get to our own thinking, our own way of seeing things. I mentioned that gelassenheit often seems to start with confrontation, bumping up against something that is concretely out of our control. And when you know it, sometimes another person's memory of what happened, or another person's experience of what happened, or another person's view of us is the thing we can't control. I'll share a recent example with my family. I didn't know my sister was going to be in the service when I wrote this part of the sermon. But it's okay, we've already processed this. So my parents and siblings were an hour and a half late to my house on Thanksgiving Day, leaving me to entertain Aunt Myra all by myself while cooking most of the meal, and I was not gelassenheiting with that at all. So that whole 90 minutes, I felt like they were throwing me under the bus, and later, after Aunt Myra had departed, I let them know about that. And for me, this part of the conflict, what actually transpired wasn't even the conflict. Rather, the conflict happens when someone says to me, but we didn't know we were supposed to be at your house by 12. Because then I think, you did know that. You just want to believe that you didn't. Now, for the record, my captive audience, I'm pretty sure I know what happened that day. And I'm pretty sure I know who did wrong by whom. But that's the point I'm trying to embrace, that I get entrenched in how right I am because I feel right. And I have such a long history of being right. So I do not enjoy admitting it, but I knew that I still wasn't gelassenheiting with this conflict because later when I complained about my family to Ali and he said something in defense of one of their perspectives, my impulse was to say, can't you just be on my side? I didn't like that he wasn't interpreting things exactly the way I was. Sometimes long after the meat of a conflict is over, I think many of us remain blindingly loyal to our own positions and perspectives, and this is a space where I think gelassenheit could be radically helpful. In an early draft, I had a big qualifier here about gelassenheit needs to be a choice that feels safe to make, blah, blah, blah. I think that what's more relevant for understanding gelassenheit's intersection with relational conflicts is that it's not so much about yielding to another person's point of view, although that is certainly valuable in lots of relationships and circumstances. I think early Anabaptists pursued gelassenheit not to submit to other people, certainly not to be better followers of human authority. They were trying to get their own self out of the way for God's will. I know I've just given half of you heart palpitations by intoning the will of God. I know that that idea has been corrupted and misused for centuries. So with very little time left, I merely want to suggest that there are times when our natural trust in our ability to interpret the data makes us less receptive to God or to the face of the other. I love Anne Lamott's remark, you can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. And in Mary's song, this celebration of the humble, she says, God has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. So my final note to you is not to question how yielding your perspective will affect your opinion on A or how you feel about B. I think gelassenheit is more a shift that entails a release from yourself, and then you just get to see what happens. It might become a question or an open door or a little path in the woods. So I want to close with words from another Mary. This is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscape, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things.